We are now live on Silicon Curtain, and this is becoming a regular Friday fixture where I'm joined by friends, people fighting for freedom, fighting against Russian BS, and it's becoming something of a kind of cafe. We haven't got a name for it, so if anyone has any ideas what we call this little sort of Friday evening cafe session, apart from people who don't have a life, which would be me, then we're open to your suggestions. Today we have Alex, Cormac, and Philip. I'm going to let each of them briefly introduce themselves, and then we're going to tackle the first topic of the day, which of course is going to be the supposed potential sabotage, which has closed Heathrow Airport. But let's go down. This is reminding me a little bit of blankety blank here, isn't it, with the little windows on top of each other. But let's start with Alex.
Hi there. So I'm Alex Ferguson. I'm the founder and CEO of a company called FAC Technology, an aerospace design organization. But probably the most important thing is that my company make kamikaze drones. In fact, we make kamikaze drone systems. And that's why I'm in Kyiv, because I've just got back from various parts of the East, seeing what units want me to change my kamikaze drones to make them better.
And Cormac.
Hello, Cormac Smith. I've spent the last 3.5 decades working in public relations and government communications. In terms of the whole Russia war against Ukraine, I guess my education really moved to the next level in 2014 when I started getting invited to former communist countries to work with people from government and from the private sector on more effective government communications. Then my education really took off in 2016 when, as a British diplomat, I traveled to Kyiv, take up a position as the full title was the Strategic Communication Advisor to the Foreign Minister of Ukraine, which I did for just under 2 years. That was kind of life-changing. It was a country I fell in love with, and people. I made many friends for life. So for the last 3 years, just over that, since about a month before the full-scale invasion, I've been a regular on TV and radio and podcasts and blogs and writing articles, really to try and give honest, informed information as to what's actually going on with Russia's war against Ukraine, rebut disinformation on every chance I get. Disinformation, I can quite honestly say now, is something I've been studying for 11 years closely. And I'm not an impartial academic, although I do have a economics degree and a politics degree sometime in the dim and distant past. I'm not impartial. I'm on Ukraine's side, as you might guess from the flag behind me.
I think that's a bit of a giveaway,
Yeah,
to the blue and yellow with tanks on it. Yeah,
the old revolutionary colors of the shirt. But anyway,
yeah, I think I'm on the same page in terms of where I stand.
Yes, there's no doubts there.
And
well, if we're showing off t-shirts, here we go. Yes, Philip.
No suits.
Well, yeah, I'll support both Cormac and Alexander's point there. I am by trade a journalist, but my objectivity is out the window. I'm half retired anyhow, so I am decidedly pro-Ukrainian. I've had about a 30-year career, 35-year career in broadcast journalism. I was a CBS radio reporter in Moscow in the 90s when I saw, the end of the Yeltsin era and the rise of Vladimir Putin, and have kept an eye on the region ever since, although I spent a good 20 years slightly distracted, in air quotes there, by the events following the attacks on 9/11. So I was a war correspondent in Iraq and Afghanistan. I was in Georgia in 2008, for example. 2014, I was on the Maidan here in Kyiv, and basically had people begging me that when, not if, the Russians would come to reclaim their colony here in Ukraine, that I wouldn't let it happen, in the shadows. So when the full-scale invasion happened, although I was trying to wean myself off of war correspondency, I felt obligated to come back. I did. I spent first year of the war, more or less, 18 months of the war, kind of traveling around the country, vlogging. But at one point decided that it would be better served maybe if I set up my own studio here, production studio here. So we did. I've got a lovely team of Ukrainians helping me out. And we put out a weekly interview show that we call On the Edge for a variety of reasons. We put it out every Sunday at 8 p.m. local here in Ukraine, and we try to platform Ukrainian voices in particular, but also voices that have useful insight and depth of knowledge, and it runs for about an hour. And so that's what we continue to do here in Kiev.
And I think that's the interesting thing. I mean, all the people who I admire and communicate with are ones that have perhaps well, that's not true. I mean, there are some fabulous voices such as Francis Durley and others who are working with the more traditional media structures. But a lot of the voices are people like you, Philip, are people like John Sweeney and others who've got alone and broken away from the traditional media machine. That it tells me that there's something maybe fundamentally broken with traditional media models, that it doesn't have the income, the revenue to actually allow people to become local area experts, to immerse themselves in a story, and indeed to sort of cover it every day. I mean, another character who you'll have bumped into is Joseph Lindsley, who had a radio show. When the owner of that radio station found out he was still on the air, he pulled the plug. So it's a bit of a guerrilla operation, but it finally came to an end. I mean, how do we get around this? Do journalists have to, at some point in their career, go AWOL as you've done?
Well, I think it's a case when it comes to traditional media of the old story of like the Brontosaurus, who was so enormous that even when it died, the message from the tail took some time to get to the head. I think we're in the process of seeing that happen with these large operations, which are very costly, and used to be, we used to have bureaus and reporters all in all four corners of the world, but that is not a business model that is manageable anymore. So I'm afraid as media adapts, we're going to have to find a way to try and keep that information flow coming out. And I think it will be individual operators. You mentioned Joe Lindsley there. John Sweeney comes in and out. I'm doing my thing here. We've got Kaylin Robertson. Kaylin Robertson, who's a fine example of this kind of thing. I'm a little long in the tooth, so I'm kind of old dogs and new tricks, doing what I can. But you're right to point this out, because what happened was, and I was well aware of this at the beginning of the full-scale invasion, was that there would inevitably come a time when the next shiny object would come along. And this is, as we all of us know, who followed this story, this is an incredibly complex story with a lot of moving parts and a lot of history and complex history. And I don't think they just wanted to make the investment, sadly, cynically. After the attack in Israel, I mean, I could go up to the Intercontinental Hotel the week prior to the attacks in Israel, and I would inevitably run into somebody that I knew from my career. It was the hub for the International Press Corps. The week after the attacks in Israel, where conveniently enough, most of these news organizations already have infrastructure, so it's not new expenditure, it's expenditure that they've already been maintaining. The Intercom was a ghost town. So I don't know how we rectify it. I think the entire media landscape is still in a transitioning phase. And folks who are able to crowdsource and do it on their own, I think are increasingly going to be doing that. What concerns me, though, oftentimes is that the vocation of journalism and trained journalists who are answerable to an editorial board, not a bad thing, a good thing, that we may lose that and have some bad faith actors who would potentially, or people who are out of their depth, rocking up with their iPhone and thinking that they, have put in the time and have the knowledge, and that muddies the information landscape. So it's going to take some time to figure this out, but we're, I think, in a transitional period.
If I might suggest that some of the infrastructure remains, but maybe not what you anticipated, because I'm staying at the Intercontinental here in Kyiv, and this seems to be where a lot of the journalism planning, frankly, happens. Like the bar, like you go down there, Kalen almost seems to live there.
Yeah, well, they parachute in, they come back for kind of, they come back for big moments, like when the anniversary of the conflict, which was only 2 weeks ago. They'll come in, they'll stay for a certain amount of time, but then they'll leave. Very few news organizations have a permanent presence here. They come and they go. So I'm sure Europe, I'll defer to you. I didn't go to the Intercon today, but I know, for example, like who did I see on the air doing some reporting? I think Christian Amanpour was here recently. But again, it's not a permanent presence. And this takes me back to this issue I have also of kind of people who don't, this is going to sound snobby, but, don't have the depth of knowledge. They pick up their iPhone or they get a, prosumer camera. They've got a YouTube channel and suddenly, they're on par with folks who've been doing this for a great deal of time. And again, are answerable to an editorial board. So I have my concerns about that, but
you could be describing me there, Philip. You could be describing me.
No,
who the hell is this Fink character?
Who the hell is he doing? Fella? I'm not one. Yeah, I don't have a monopoly on. And I would defer to you any day of the week, Jonathan. Your knowledge is formidable. There was a TikToker who came here, an American TikToker, about 4 months ago, 6 months ago, who had really no concept of what was happening here. And he started putting out really irresponsible material. That's the kind of thing I'm concerned about. Sincere, earnest people who come here to do the job properly, no problem. But
I'll point this to Cormac. Yeah. I'll put this to Cormac, because some of these people don't just come with naivety. They come with ill intent, or they come from, say, a right-wing, podcasting media environment. And they're looking for material that they think is going to fit their audience and their ideology. But yeah, over you, Cormac.
Well, look, I wanted to go back even further. I mean, we can address the issue of the bad faith actors in a moment, but I want to go back a little bit further than that. And I want to go back to the start of my career in government 25 years ago. And I've never been a journalist. My father, maybe 40 years ago, thought I should be, but I never got around to it. But I have worked in public relations for the best part of 4 decades. And in doing that, it was essential that I had good relationships with journalists. And to do that, it was essential that if I'd never been a journalist, I certainly understood how journalists worked and how newsrooms worked and so forth. So, Philip, I can say, because I was never a journalist, journalism is an honorable profession that has a code of conduct, and that sets it apart from a lot of other professions, and it certainly sets it apart from they call themselves citizen journalists and they call themselves various things. But more important than that, and this is a concern I've had for some time, when I first started working in government and local government, the first thing when I worked for a new local authority I would do is I would find out who the editor of the local newspaper was. And I would arrange to meet them either in their office, my office, or preferably if they were up for it in the pub for a pint. And what I was meeting 25 years ago were grizzled old hacks who had been on Fleet Street. They had been around the country. They had massive experience. And they had, even at local newspapers, they had well-staffed newsrooms. And the last local government job I did was 2015. And I've been told it's even worse now. And I reached out to the editor of the local newspaper. And no offense, but I met a child, and that child had about one or two other people in the newsroom with, it was a him, as it was, and they just didn't have the resources to do that proper job. And I'll give you my definition of the job of a good journalist, and I've already said a honorable profession that works to a code of conduct. It's to shine a light in dark corners, and it's to hold the powerful to account, and it's to seek out the truth. It's not to say on the one hand this and the one hand that. If somebody says it's raining, the journalist's job is to stick his or head out the window and see if it's raining or not. Now we've seen a lot of issues with both sides, but here is my big concern. I was educated in the 70s and the 80s, and I was educated to believe that the media was the fourth estate, going back to the ideals of the French Revolution, i.e., it was the fourth pillar of a functioning democratic society. And today, that's more important than ever. We can't have a fully functioning democratic society without a strong media who will hold the powerful, both in the private and the public and the NGO sector, up to account. And they will work to those rigid code of conduct that you have when you spend years training and doing your work experience to be a journalist and to climb up the ladder. And it's one of the hardest ladders to climb up to get, as you will know, Philip. But I was looking at a very well respected report recently. It's the Economist Intelligence Unit, and they produce an audit of democracy, and a global audit of democracy each year, where they measure democracy on about, I think off from memory, several tens of different indicators. Sorry, I don't have the exact figures, but less than 9% of the world last year was considered to be a full democracy. And this has been in retreat in the last 4 or 5 years. Now, remarkably, this was even before Donald Trump came into power. America was not considered a full democracy. America was considered a flawed democracy. We can just ask ourselves, with everything that's going on in the first 2 months of 47 in the White House, how far democracy is going to retreat in the United States. But we have a major problem at the moment. Democracy is under threat. And without a strong, independent, principled media run by professional gatekeepers, it's going to be harder. It's going to be harder to sustain democracy. So I don't have the answers in terms of the challenges to the business model, because obviously media organizations have to wash their face. They have to pay the bills. But it's a major problem, and it's one I've seen certainly over the last decade or so from my workings in local and central government in the UK. But it's something that I'm very, very concerned about. And part of what we need to do is we need to get back to respecting professional journalists. Because in my 35, 40-year career, what I learned was, and I was very often on the opposite side of the coin to the journalist, but what I learned and what I always teach people is the journalist was not my friend, although I have made friends with many. The journalist was not my friend, nor were they my enemy. And it was about having that honest relationship with journalists. I'll leave it there for the moment. It's a huge concern of mine.
Yeah, I know we don't want to make this into a media forum, but I will add one little addendum to that, Cormac. You point out the role of the press corps and the importance of the press corps in terms of the fourth estate, in terms of truth to power, to putting a light on those spots, those shadows in the corners. There's another important role that I feel very strongly about, and it is that journalists are also the first draft of history.
Yeah,
and
I agree completely.
If you, and this is particularly important in this conflict, or any conflict, including involving the Muscovites, because the Russians will, if they are allowed to, take control of the narrative from the very initial point, and they will twist that narrative to their own information warfare ends. And so journalists have to be there to document firsthand what is truly happening as objectively as anybody possibly can. And true objectivity is an impossibility, but the goal is worth pursuing, because if we don't tell the narrative from our, as best as we possibly can be, objective point of view, the Russians certainly will, and we've seen it time and time and time again.
And that's
If I
what
might jump in.
got with
Could I just back up what you say, Philip? I learned, and 20, 25 years ago, when something went wrong in the office, we used to say, well, look, we're not saving lives, nobody is dying. What we're all involved in now is we are saving lives, and people are dying. There's lives on the line. But I learned something 25, 30 years ago as a PR running campaigns. And what I learned was very, very simple. If you want to get a campaign out, you maybe pick a certain platform to give an exclusive to, because we absolutely knew that the first cut of a story went so far in determining how that story would run on. That's an absolute basic truth. And that's what you're saying about the Russian dominance of the space and so forth. So we have got to somehow find a way to get back to more I won't use the word objective, professional, principled journalism that gets out there. And as I love your comment about, as a witness to history, it's vital.
So if I might come in as
Alex, go for it.
If I might come in as a non-journalist, but as someone who was born and grew up in Hong Kong, I'm not trying to blow smoke up your asses. I'm just drawing an analogy. From the Hong Kongers' perspective, the first thing that they attacked before they attacked our freedom was the free press. It's a shaping operation, I would say. So an attack on free press is essentially, in my opinion, as a non-journalist, just an observer, it's a shaping operation before an attack on your liberties.
Here.
Absolutely.
And we'll come to the US, because that's clearly what's unfolding, and the preparations of some of those narratives were happening. But this is one of the challenges, because I think it's, we've talked about this before, Cormac, which is that Putin does not understand the mechanics of democracy. He doesn't understand the benefits of democracy, but he understands the weaknesses of democracy, and he understands how to undermine it and destroy it. It's the same with media mechanics. They've developed a series of techniques which have now been exported to the MAGA GOP. And these techniques fundamentally break. Traditional journalism might, the Cold War journalism might have had some chance against it. But our current state of journalism doesn't have the sort of immune system to fight it. If you flood the zone with nonsense stories in an environment where journalists have minimal context, and where you're operating what they think is the right way to journalism, which is to both sides things rather than provide verified context, I call it the sort of the goldfish approach to journalism. Let's pretend we have no prior knowledge. Well, propaganda is going to win in that game ultimately every single time. And I think that's kind of what we're seeing. The other tendency is normalization, which we've talked about quite a lot. And we're seeing some horrific normalization of almost everything that's going on. Something horrific's happened. Right, let's rationalize it. Let's pretend it didn't happen. Let's chop the sharp edges off and just sort of, soften it down, ultimately, so we don't have to do anything about it. So I think we need to evolve new rules of journalism, actually, which there's a degree of resistance to doing that. And everyone who is understanding the weaknesses are just far too busy trying to put out content. to plug the gap and fill the thing. I don't think many people are thinking about how to fundamentally change the way journalism is taught and the economic models behind it.
And so much of it has become white noise that to rise above the white noise and the furor of all the glut of information, of product that's coming out there. I'm not going to call it information because to further my point, it is increasingly people who are producing content are looking for an emotional response. They're not looking to convey information. They're trying to, if not clickbait, they're trying to rise above that white noise. And I think that's another issue that at some point we're going to have to address. Is journalism about the conveyance of information, again, as objective as you possibly can get it, or has this new business model produced this clickbaity emotional response that falls so welcomely into what Moscow does, because they know that if they can get you incensed and emotional, that the information can be more easily manipulated. I've seen it, so much. I mean, you just have to look at RT and that kind of stuff, and how that seeps into, for goodness sakes, Tulsi Gabbard is now national. She's she's NSA, or is she DNI? But she admitted that she gets most of her information from RT, which is literally just saying, I'm getting my information from the Kremlin. So that's another issue, this kind of like emotional manipulation of people and hiding, misinformation, disinformation underneath an emotional response, over Pavlovian.
May I suggest that they are following the Chinese playbook on Hong Kong? So first China went for the free press, and then the next thing they went for was the education system. So I'd say that what you've seen in America with the removal of DEI heroes, like the fact that the Navajo, talkers have
the
been
code
removed.
talkers.
Exactly. All of this is just whitewashing history. Is just like, that's going to feed through into the educational system. This is literally the Chinese playbook in Hong Kong.
Well, and I saw it in Moscow with Yeltsin. As Yeltsin was, on his way out the door, we saw Mikhail Lesin and Vladimir Putin do this. I mean, the first thing he did was he shut down NTV.
It's an interesting one there, isn't it, Philip? Because there's two reasons he went after NTV, and a lot of people focus on the news, because it's like, you don't want news there. But actually, the news wasn't the biggest threat to his regime. Satire was. He bought it so he could shut down the equivalent of Spitting Image, because one of the first episodes they produced when he was prime minister, they portrayed him as this kind of evil gargoyle dwarf from I think it was Tales of Bachman or something, some 19th century or Tales of Hoffman, I think it was
Wormtongue in Lord of the Rings.
There was that as well.
He was gray, and he was kind of slightly oily and
really evil and sinister, really short. They played on his height. And of course, we know the effect Spitting Image has on destroying political careers. No, he had to get rid of that first. So, and I'm putting out an episode soon, which is, the one is, first they came for the trade unions, then they came for whatever, and then they came for whatever. No, first they come for the satirists, then they come for the mainstream news.
Philip, I think it's interesting, in a way, none of this is new. And for some reason, I wrote a paper as part of my politics and economics degree 40 years ago on the rise of fascism in Europe during between the two wars in the 1930s. And I distinctly remember a number of the factors which I identified, and one of those factors was a distinct and a common call for emotion over logic. Now, this is fascism 101. I think it was Mussolini who said, no man goes far who knows where he's going. And maybe it was Franco who said that, a call for blind, passionate action. And we have the exact same thing. I mean, the Brexit referendum here in the UK was a typical example. In terms of a campaign, the Leave campaign was brilliant. It absolutely worked. It had a basic emotional appeal: take back control, fear of immigration, and promising people £350 million a week to be spent on the NHS, which absolutely got people's heartstrings. Well, the Remain campaign, and I sat in the middle of the government team that was running the government's Remain campaign in 2016. It was bloody awful. It was all about a black and white leaflet to every house, and it was dubbed as it was about fear, but it was giving lots and lots of statistics, but it never got across the emotional appeal of why people should want to stay in the European Union. So we lost, and we see the same raw base emotional appeal in the MAGA campaign, and clearly the majority of American people have voted Donald Trump in for the second time based on very, very raw base emotional appeals. The difference is, of course, with the rise of digital technology leading to the internet and social media, and now the rise of artificial intelligence, in parallel with the decline, which we've spoken about already, of the traditional media, it's giving the propagandists an advantage and a reach and a potency that Joseph Goebbels could never have even dreamed of. But we have a major challenge. I have very, very often said, and I was having a few drinks with a friend of mine who's a former colonel in military intelligence and some other people yesterday, and I was saying, there has never been a war in history as the Russia's war against Ukraine, where the information sphere is so vital and so important. And it's that very fact that keeps me doing what I've been doing for the last 3 years. So I think it's, again, I'm not sure I have any answers to share tonight, but I think it's useful in a conversation that we really clearly frame the problem we're dealing with. But my point is, there's nothing new under the sun. The principles, I believe, are the same principles that were being developed by Goebbels and the Nazi Party in the 1930s. But there is just so much, the amplifier on the stereo system now, and the amplifier and the speakers are so much more powerful than they ever were before. But the tape deck or the record player is pretty well the same. And the record's the same.
I've got an interesting sort of conundrum for you guys. Now, we're going to talk about Heathrow in a minute, and a lot of people are joining because, they really want to hear our views on the extraordinary events today. But just lastly, sticking on this, before he came on, I saw some outraged NAFO or NAFO, however you pronounce it, sort of guys on Twitter really dunking on the BBC, and rightly incensed, because clearly, some journalist who is looking to, I would say, get their spurs or create a name for themselves has interviewed one of the Kremlin's most vile propagandists, who is called as Karaganov, I think it wasn't it, that was interviewed. I mean, a really, really vile piece of shit. He absolutely is. He's an apologist for genocide. He's an apologist to the Russian invasion. He fervently says, I don't know what he believes, because in the 90s he was a liberal and now he's a fascist, just like Medvedev. But they interviewed him and they gave him this platform on the BBC to spew his vile nonsense. And it's the kind of nonsense you can find anywhere. It doesn't help anybody to parse or understand, let's say, how propaganda works. It's just a funnel for propaganda. So yeah, I'd love to hear your views on that, because I think it's fairly black and white. And of course, Alex's point of view, being in the NAFO collective, because, what you guys do, what I do is in that persona is dunk on these propagandists and try and mock them rather than engage in them as serious people. The challenge I've got is I've got an opportunity. I won't say is I've got an opportunity to talk to somebody who has sort of flitted in and out and been half in and out of that propagandistic sphere. And he knows how it works, but ostensibly now is one of Putin's enemies, and almost certainly would be killed or locked up if he were to return. I'm not going to sort of do the whole, oh, he's part of the opposition and blah, blah, blah. You know, I have certain views on the Russian opposition and the ineffectiveness. But here is someone who is ostensibly an enemy of Putin, who's done some very sort of questionable work, and he's done some very interesting work, but he could explain very well to a Western audience how the mechanics of this propaganda work. Is it a good idea to interview a Russian, albeit knowing that there may be some stuff in there that you fundamentally disagree with, but also some stuff that might be quite useful in the fight that we find ourselves in?
It's an interesting question. I think in that particular circumstance, the benefit of the insight into the machinations would be of use, and so by that merit in and of itself, I'd say go for it. Talking to a guy like Dugan, which I guess
definitely
CNN
not
did.
Dugan.
No. I know.
Someone posted that. Yeah.
No, Cormac, you mentioned that Dugan had recently been interviewed, and I think that was CNN that had done that. Yeah, I mean, there's no benefit to that. We're going to hear the same thing we've heard from him 100 times, and it's fatal. So I don't know. In that particular instance, I would say there is benefit. So there's, go for it. But I also want to point out that as we've already addressed, that there's a new media landscape, new technology, and all the rest of it. There's the famous story of course, the KGB during the Cold War having dropped. Their technique was to drop into a relatively obscure or a third nation publication. The famous story being them putting that the CIA created AIDS. They put it in the Times of Delhi, I believe it was. This was in the early 80s, I want to say, early mid 80s. And then they just let it sit there, and it would germinate for months and months and months until a English language source would pick it up, and then we're off to the races. Well, that is no longer necessary. You can put out a tweet and it can be picked up by Elon Musk, and within moments it's heard all the way around the world. So we have to contend with that as well. And the Russians still, I mean, there's a reason why before we started calling it gaslighting, we used to call it a Potemkin village. They're very good at this. They have been doing it for a very long time. Their techniques are very well taught, well thought out. There's an entire school of how to do this, which I think your interview subject might be able to shed some light on. So great. But I think we also need to be aware that they're using the same techniques that they have always used, but they're in hyperspeed because of the modern information age.
Jonathan, can I come in?
Yes.
Right. There is no, going back to your original question, should you or shouldn't you? Here's the thing. There's no one size fits all rule. We need to take each on a case by case basis, and bear with me a moment. We're at war now. And something I'm very, very eager to develop, and I was speaking to Philip Ingram actually about it yesterday. I said, if you go back to von Clausewitz, Karl von Clausewitz, who was a great Prussian military strategist of the 19th century, he said, and I'm paraphrasing very, very simply, to win at war, you need the three pillars of your society in harmony. That's, you need your government, you need your armed forces, but you need your society in harmony. And we are in a situation now, I've been saying, as you know, for a year and a half, 2 years, the wolf will come to our door. The wolf is now at our door. And it does seem that, prompted by 47's appearance in the White House, that Europe is starting to wake up. And we'll talk about Heathrow in a moment and what we think that may be. But there is absolutely no question. The foreign minister that I worked for, Pavlo Klimkin, in a security conference out in Halifax in the late 2017, told the world's media and the conference and anybody who would listen that we're not in a Cold War, we're actually in a hot war already. And we used to say that one of the most important things to understand about Russia is the nature of Russian hybrid warfare. And it's not a secret, it's all out there in open source, but our leaders have been far, far too slow to learn about it and then to educate our society and our citizens about it. The Finns and the Swedes do a little bit better. They're probably the best at this. So I think the point that I'm trying to make here is we are at war. We have no obligation to pick a one-size-fits-all rule. And I think, and I'll give an example, I think the BBC is often guilty of picking a one-size-fits-all rule to both sides issues. And I can think of no more disgusting example than the dam that was blown up, and the night after the dam that was blown up on a late night news program, Jeremy Bowen, the BBC's international editor, and I've actually got the clip, I can send it to anybody who wants it, said, well, of course, we may never really know who blew up the dam. It could have been the Ukrainians, it could have been the Russians, or maybe it was just worn out and it fell apart. And that was absolutely disgusting. And he dismissed the Ukrainian claim that, of course, the Ukrainians and their friends, they will tell you the Russians did it, but we may never know. And he said this with a smirk on his face. So, we have got to, I had this debate when I was out in Kyiv about, when the Ukrainians were starting to block and shut down certain Russian social media platforms. And those from the liberal West, I remember being in a conversation with the ambassador from Sweden to discuss this. And, he was a very good and decent man. He had been a journalist himself, but he felt that, no, you must allow all media to thrive. We're at war. You don't do this at war. We need to realize the war is not coming. We're now in it. It is only going to get hotter and hotter and hotter. Anybody, and most people, and probably many of the folks listening in, will think that this is hyperbolic and that it's not that bad. We are at war. A hot war is coming, and we are probably closer to World War III than we have ever been in any of our lifetimes. So we need to see the media questions through that prism. We do what is in the best in the best interest of our society. Sorry, Jonathan, I'll stop.
No, don't know. Here's one for Alex. Look at this. Look at this on the screen. This, because these live streams often will attract a lot of trolls and bots. We're about to talk about how what happened doesn't seem like a coincidence. And here you have the classic troll or bot behavior. Hi, Jimmy, whoever you are, if you're indeed even a person. Britain's crumbling infrastructure. We squandered our money on Ukraine instead. Well, this is a classic way of manipulating the narrative. Let's take this down, though, because that is just a ridiculous comment.
Okay. Well, let's go to that.
Right, emblematic of the trolls.
Heathrow Airport is run by a private company. It is not paid for by taxpayers. It is a business in the business of making money. This is not a tax-funded cash cow. This is a for-profit business. It is also an it is part of our infrastructure. It is regulated by the Civil Aviation Authority because it is critical to our national security and our way of life. So yes, there is a state-funded oversight body, essentially, the Civil Aviation Authority, who looks over it. But essentially, if you are in aerospace, you essentially pay to be regulated by them. The British taxpayer is not paying for Heathrow Airport. It is a private company operating for profit. It is limited in its operations in terms of how much profit it can make or what it can do by, one, the government, and two, the regulators. It is not British taxpayers' money which is responsible for this.
They are responsible for the electricity infrastructure, but again, because it's a critical asset, you're
And
the
they would have
expert
invested in
on
that.
this stuff.
Yeah.
So
like,
how many forms of redundancy would there have been? One goes down, surely you would have several, backup solutions. But here we see the whole thing taken down.
Yeah, there's no hard and fast answer. So once again, I work on the stuff that is flying or orbiting versus like an airport, but the principles are common. Like the principles in commercial aerospace are common. You have to guarantee a level of essentially redundancy, and you have to be able to quantify how robust that is. And literally, there are multiple levels of statistics. You have to say is like, this is how much stuff has to go wrong for this to get knocked out. So the idea that one thing just randomly went down, which once again is also quite hard to do, and that knocked out the entire place, either there is some massive wide-scale corruption on the civil engineering side, and that's not impossible. Look at Grenfell Towers. That was essentially a function of rampant corruption on an industrial scale. But is it possible that this was just a bad one-off? Yes. But the reason why aerospace regulators exist is to make it so bloody unlikely that a random one-off accident could lead to such... Well, fortunately, no one has died. But the idea is that there should be such redundancy built in that you cannot have a single point of failure. In fact, you need to have multiple points of failure. This is all defined mathematically, but that is the lay explanation of it. You cannot have a single point of failure in aerospace. If that thing fails, and it means someone might die. Like if an airplane's coming into land and you lose all your airport facilities, that is potentially a loss of life. That is critical. Therefore, you cannot have a single point of failure. That is not acceptable.
And one would also assume that in the circumstances, yes, civic aviation, there'll be people looking to this from an engineering point of view. One can also imagine there'll be people looking at this from not just a terrorist point of view, but we'll also be looking at this from a point of view of national security. Whether they announce all this or not, whether it's formal or not, one must presume they're going to be all over this, trying to figure out that if it was intentional, then how do we secure other infrastructure from similar malicious intent?
Hypothetically, we kick off. We're an island. We are not secure in our supply to produce any of the things needed to defend ourselves, let alone feed ourselves. So knocking out our airplanes and our ports would be a great way to strangle us. Like, wars are won by economies and logistics. You choke a country off by its logistics, which means in modern day, ports and airplanes. Doesn't matter how good your army is if you can't support it. So yeah, go for the choke points. And that's where we're vulnerable. And the thing is, if this was a malicious attack, if it was terrorists, they would have gone to kill people in the streets. They would want blood in the streets. No one died. It's designed to correct, in my opinion, designed to create maximum disruption, minimal bloodshed. But it's a warning sign, because if you can disrupt, our ability to bring in foods, bring in supplies, bring in fuel, essentially sustain the nation. I mean, that's literally like pointing a gun at someone. Like,
which is a very
it's a serious threat.
Form of signal, isn't it? Right?
Yeah,
it is.
Exactly.
This is very Russian. This is it seems it has the whiff of sulfur that is the GRU or the SVR. And they do this. We have seen them. Jonathan, you earlier said that doing reporting without context is doing a disservice. To look at this as an isolated incident, if indeed it was terrorism, and if indeed it was Russian, clandestine efforts to boot, this must be seen in the context of other attacks that we are very well aware that it was the Russians behind it. I recall having lunch about 5 years ago, with a contact of mine within the Department of Homeland Security in the United States, who openly said to me, we know they're inside our systems. We know that they have the capacity to say, cause a catastrophic collapse of a dam, for example, that would flood everything, all the cities and towns down river of that dam and kill countless, who knows how many. There's the incident here in Kiev where they infiltrated the nuclear power plant. There's all sorts of clandestine efforts that have been happening in the last 3 years, of course, notably in Germany. I do think that we need, and Cormac is 100% correct, and I hate the fact that it sounds hyperbolic to say it to those who have not been paying attention, but we are indeed at war with Russia. And we have been at war with Russia for quite some time. And part of that is because Russia believes it's at war with us. So it doesn't matter what our opinions are. They think they're at war with us in the West, and in particular the Anglo-American alliance, and they are acting accordingly. If this does turn out to be connected to Moscow, none of us should be surprised.
Yeah, I mean, I can't really add an awful lot to what either of you have said. I mean, Alexander, the fact that I think you set it out very, very clearly that this could be a one-off catastrophic incident, but it is highly unlikely. I have spoken to a number of experts in their field, shall we say, in terms of military intelligence and fire safety. And everybody's opinion is this has the hallmarks of the GRU all over it. Now, we obviously need to wait and see. There needs to be an investigation. We are at the point of circumstantial evidence at the moment to those of us who are involved in this field and have been for many years. It's the first thought that came to us. Let us see, because I think if we jump to conclusions too soon, we damage ourselves in the information warfare field by cutting down our own credibility. So I'm happy to sit here with two other experts and say, yes, it does have all the hallmarks of, or it has the fingerprints all over it. And that's why I found what Alexander said was so important, because you set out evidence and you set out science to say why this was highly unlikely, not impossible. It could be a catastrophic failure. I think we need to wait and see, but in the meantime, we need to be not sitting on our hands waiting. We need to be going to work, because we do know, what we absolutely do know is that malign forces, among them the Kremlin, are operating in our country, and they will work with criminals of various hues to get those criminals to do certain jobs for them, and possibly giving them plausible deniability. We know that this is how they work. We know that this is how they have worked in other countries, and we are pretty sure that it is how they have worked and will continue to work in the United Kingdom. And as Philip, as you said, it doesn't matter whether we think we're at war with Russia or not. They know they believe they are at war with us. How much more evidence do we need before we wake up, stand up, and tool up?
So as Cormac, I cannot disagree that they will hire the cheapest, most effective resource to do the job, so criminal gangs. But randomly, I have been involved in looking at blast shields for substations. To get those things to go off like that, like, once again, I'm just looking at it. Let's wait for the analysis, etc. But to get like the oil in transformer stations, it's not your regular mineral oil. That the flash point of that stuff is not your regular. Like, if you can't just take your regular stuff from the store and go, oh, I can make this burn, therefore I can make a substation burn. If someone wanted to do that maliciously, now once again, it could have just been some random catastrophic disaster. But to do that maliciously requires a level of subject matter expertise to research what is in it to make that thing cook off. So once again, let's wait for the data. It is possible. I mean, stuff goes wrong. It happens in aerospace. We do a whole load of mass. Planes rarely randomly fall out the sky, but it has happened. So maybe something randomly went wrong, but my spidey senses suggest unlikely.
Let's stick with the
hypothesis
because let's stick with hypothesis because then there's a challenge, isn't there, for governments? And we have seen this over and over in the last couple of months with the proven attempt to assassinate. I think it was the CEO of Rheinmetall, various warehouse fires, the DHL planes. There's a whole series of very clear provocations and sabotage. There are other ones which are the sort of grey zone stuff. The cables mysteriously get cut. The cruiser ships just happen to be Russian and Chinese, but of course they have nothing to do with it. It's they were drunk at the wheel or wherever it happens to be, including the accident that happened last week where a crew captained by a Russian just happened to run into an American ship with aviation fuel. What are the chances? But then there's a challenge for government, and up to now there has been a fairly low level or low key response to these. I'm sure behind the scenes the responses are a little more serious, but certainly they have not sought to use these events to present to the public the case that you've just mentioned there, Cormac, that we are actually in a hot war with Russia that is behaving like ISIS. They're not going for mass casualty events, but they are seeking to harm our economies. Our politicians have not used that as a moment of inflection and leadership. But these events are scaling up. So at what point are we going to see this pivot where, potentially we have an address to the nation? Not that we are at war in Chamberlain moment, but we are at hybrid war. How do you do that? What happens next?
When? Yesterday.
Yesterday, yes. No, I agree. Again, I met a lot of public affairs officers when I was in the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and many of them, when they returned after the wars, they went into public affairs for the intelligence community or other various security apparatus, and so I have spoken to a great many of them about this question of how deeply have we been infiltrated by the Russians? How much of a danger do they pose? And I've heard back from not all, but some of them who say we have to weigh this out on a fine balancing line. We have to tell the public what is happening. Obviously, we have to keep our public informed, but we don't want to cause a panic, nor do we want to malign or to weaken, undermine our various institutions because they have been infiltrated by the Russians. I think about, just how compromised is Donald J. Trump? There's a lot of talk about that. Do you want to openly say that our elections are no longer functional because they've been infiltrated by Russia? That's an extreme example. Or, do you want to let people know that the GRU is inside of our electrical grid and could at a moment's notice, switch it off for God knows how long, and how long could we sustain ourselves? So I feel compassion for those guys who are trying to do the proper thing to revealing to the public the very real danger and the risk, and the fact that yes, we are at war because Russia thinks they're at war with us. And how much do we want to try and keep a grip on things so that there isn't a panic? And I think that's also a consideration to take into account.
Well, it looks like we've exhausted that one, possibly, potentially. But a lot of stuff has happened. No, we have more.
Well, no, I mean, I would just finish up by saying, the first, and of course, when we talk about hybrid war, we talk about a lot of different activities working in unison together, working strategically together. Disinformation is one of them. The sort of possible malicious attacks on infrastructure is another. Cyber attacks are another. Agent provocateur to stir up trouble at protests, whatever. The list goes on and on. But one of the early lessons I learned was back in 2016, the first foreign trip that I made when I was out in Kyiv was to Helsinki. And I had a meeting of a group called the Friends of Ukraine in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Finland. And sitting around the table were all the European nations and NATO and the Americans and the Canadians, and it was a big, big table. And we had presentations from the Finns and the Swedes. And I found that day, and nothing has changed my mind since, that the people that really know, talking about disinformation now, but there's a parallel for other forms of hybrid attack. What they recognized was that you needed to, the only way to, fact checking doesn't work. Rebutting doesn't work. You have got to make the population resilient to the fire hose of falsehoods that used to be just coming from the Kremlin. Now it's coming out of the White House as well. It's hitting us from both angles. And the only way to do that was to really focus on critical thinking. Now, in the UK, I think we are so far behind the curve on this. The Finns and the Swedes address critical thinking with kids in school, certainly from the age of 14. So when the kids go on the internet, which they're going to do, they have some developed faculties to actually discriminate between what might be right and what might be wrong, and to look at the sources and that. We're not even on the starting line. And I think, I talk about the need we don't just need to have our governments and our armed forces on a war footing. We need to have our societies on a war footing. And part of that is making people resilient and aware to what is happening. And I think back, I wasn't living in London at the time, and Jonathan, I don't know if you were, but during the IRA bombing campaigns, I think there was a collective sense that everybody was on the lookout.
I was living in London during that period of time, and yes,
there you go. So
absolutely.
I don't know, but it is about, we need societies alert and robust and inured to a certain way to what's going on. And until we do that, because with Russia, you have a society that's been on a war footing for many, many decades. And they have been told for many decades that that the West is a threat. They're at war with the West. The West is decadent. It's their job someday, one day soon, to invade the West and save it from itself. And we've seen all of this stuff. That's why probably Putin still enjoys an 80% plus approval rating, both for himself and for the war in Ukraine, despite coming close to 1 million casualties over the last 3 years. The country is on a war footing. That's a very, very different society to what we have in the West. Their expectations are very, very different. They don't generally have an expectation of freedom or democracy or liberal democracy as we know it, but that's another conversation. But they're on a war footing. They will take an awful lot of punishment, and they will put up with an awful lot of pressure on their standard of living and the loss of sons and fathers and uncles and brothers and whatever. They're on a war footing. We're not. They see us as soft, and to a large extent we are. But I would suggest, when you look at the experience of, I don't know what they call the Brit spirit before all of our time, we have it in us. We're capable of hardening up very, very quickly. But, to ordinary people thinking, what does that mean to me? It might mean you pay more taxes. It might mean you actually see your some of your critical public services reduced. It might even see in due course that there is some form of martial law imposed and we have restrictions on our freedoms. That is what happens in a time of war. Now, how do we get that across to people? Because until we get there, we are going to be second best to the Russians and the Chinese.
Absolutely, yeah. Absolutely. And we're heading into choppy times, which is why I think all of us have such an affinity with Ukrainians, because when you say this to them, they say, of course, They don't look at you as
Where
if
you
you've
been?
lost your mind. They're like, well, of course.
Welcome
we've
to
been
the
doing this
party.
for... Yeah, that's right. You're a little bit late, but better late than never. Before we all let you sort of, go and get your beauty sleep, which, some of us need more than others.
Well,
The other topic
I think
wanted...
Volva might have something to say about that. Wouldn't you say, Alex? Because I think we here in Kiev might have a fitful night. I just have a
Yeah,
feeling.
we shall see. Well, it depends. Are the satellites still on or off? Who knows?
We didn't tell the audience, but yeah, two of our esteemed company are in Kiev, and of course, it's been a little bit bumpy,
Noisy already tonight.
Yeah, it
ever
depends how
since
Donald Trump
President
feels in
Trump
terms of turning the
announced
satellites
peace.
off.
Yes, as soon as he announced
Um,
peace, it all kicked off.
Jonathan, if it's okay, can I make one request?
Yes, of course.
So a friend of mine has been a volunteer out here from very shortly after the start. You've never heard of him because he doesn't go on social media. He just gets the job done. But he was supporting mostly international fighters. And yesterday, 2 years ago to the day, his mate, Kone Taitai, New Zealander, died in combat. So if you have a moment, pouring out for Kane. Glory to the heroes.
I'm
Cheers.
afraid it's water, but Horium Slava.
To Kane and all the other heroes.
I will have a little tram to that, because
That's
those
cool.
images of Ukrainians kneeling by the roadside, no matter who they are, as those corteges go past, it breaks your heart to
Happens
see
far
that.
too often. And to see them, I live downtown, and I won't dox myself by saying exactly where I live, but the street in front of me is a thoroughfare, and yep, they still do it. They will take to a knee as the funeral procession passes, and it breaks your heart. It really does.
And
It's
as
very
will I
moving.
every damn time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Likhachev Cemetery is the one I've seen in Lviv.
It's
I mean,
taken
it's a daily
taken over
occurrence.
the entire
Daily
field of
occurrence.
Mars. It's taken over the field.
Yeah,
I have
it's
pictures.
huge.
I have pictures from the first days of this war when I was in Lviv, and they had the spillover into the field of Mars out of the cemetery, and there were maybe 6 graves, and you go there now and the entire field is filled.
There's
with
thousands.
That's
It's
just
horrific. It's grown. It's
devastating.
doubled since I was there a year and a half. Before we get to the final topic, before we all let everyone have their beauty sleep, I wanted to draw attention to Car for Ukraine, which is going to be familiar to a lot of people on the channel. We sourced a number of vehicles, a whole bunch of YouTubers in the community. We raised around 160,000 euros. In December, that was enough to buy 15 vehicles. Many of you will know those vehicles ended up in Lviv, and you'll have heard some of the interesting stories around that. You probably haven't heard all the stories, but they will all eventually be shared. These vehicles are then made battle ready, and they're sent to various battalions in the east. Some are rapid evacuation vehicles. Some have rockets and stuff strapped to the back, but they all help to save lives and push back the worst kind of illegal immigrant, which is Russian soldiers. We're doing it all over again. And our ambition, of course, has grown because the last campaign was successful. So we're doing it again. There's a whole bunch. You will see quite a few live streams over the next couple of weeks. But please do, if you can, help. The money goes directly to charity. I've now been on the ground, excuse me. I've been on the ground, I've seen the operation, I've met the guys there who are just extraordinary, and seen how much of their lives and their families' lives go into this operation, and also seen the extraordinary transparency that they swear by. So I'll leave that up on the screen. Do help if you can. And we will be doing a lot more live streams, including with Jonathan Pierce and others, and Rick the Ukrainian through the week. The last topic I wanted to go through, and because we've got one of the world's foremost experts on drones and composite materials, which is Alex, I had a fascinating conversation on the channel, which went live just this evening with Benjamin Tallis, and it was talking about the huge increase in defense spending in Germany. We know there's also a European package as well, but we were discussing the real problem there, that actually, yes, that money's being released, but there's a real risk of it going on fighting the last war, going on legacy systems, as opposed to investing in not just sort of platforms and bits of kit, but investing in an agile methodology that allows you to constantly innovate technology, training, and become more adaptable, and create a procurement process that reduces the unit cost down. This is, I might sound like I know what I'm talking about, but I really don't. But Alex does. This is a topic which I'm sure you find fascinating there, because we're now talking about huge, retooling in Europe, a rearmament process. What is going to be the challenge from your point of view of actually capturing the kind of innovation and agility born out of necessity, which the Ukrainians are showing? And how do you do that for a large, cumbersome Western procurement process?
Well, I've been out here with, since literally the start of the month, of all sorts of units, showing them what I call my NATO drone, my NATO plus friends specification drone, and then proceeding to get chewed out by NCOs from drone operating units. But I think one of the interesting observations is when I get chewed out by the NCOs before the officers pull them off me, is they're chewing me out for different reasons. Different units here, like I've been out with, soft, counter assault, artillery. These guys all have different needs. But the thing is, everyone looks at the drone, they look at this and goes, it's the same drone. It's just like, no, the platform is the same. The way they configure it is different. So one of my ideas, there are so many problems, I don't even know where to start, but one of the ideas that maybe I can take home and go, rather than investing in a one-size-fits-all system, maybe we can look at a couple of platforms and then let the Ukrainians configure those platforms to what they need, because that is actually what is done here. So even with state contracts, like the guys who've got the big contracts, they will send a whole bunch of drones to the units. You go to those units and go, yeah, we got a bunch of drones, and we then spend a whole load of time reconfiguring the electronics and the comms to what we need them to do. But NATO thinks they know better than Ukrainians about how to fight drone wars than Ukraine. So Ukraine is going to get one-size-fits-all drones from NATO. Slow clap. But maybe there is a case for, what are we good at? There are some countries, and say actually world class is Baltic when it comes to comms and counter EW from what I've seen. Maybe, I would like to think I have a best in class capability on platforms, but maybe there are others. But maybe there should be a case of, let's get the best in class tech, not necessarily system, from the West, and then work with Ukrainians and invest in Western companies working with Ukrainian companies to integrate that to specifically what Ukrainian units need. And that will change month by month by month. But Western companies will then have to learn to adapt to that, or they will fail. So maybe there's a way of creating a competitive process, whereas provide your best in class, find a Ukrainian partner company, support them in integrating it. And if you can't do it, you lose. But then this is capitalism. Let the companies who are able to provide a new capability to the Ukrainians succeed. But also there's another problem, which is, it was the Latvians who said it. The International Drone Capability Coalition is going to deliver 1 million FPV drones a year. I know everyone who does FPV drones within NATO and friends. It's completely effing impossible unless we have Ukrainian companies helping us. So, I see this. I see a lot of also nationalism. It's like, I want an Estonian drone, a Lithuanian drone, a British drone. This is bonkers. This is not how aerospace works. And yes, it's a nascent industry, but it will become, in my opinion, similar to how to automotive or aerospace industry has that, which is you have consolidation, and then you have countries and companies which are just really damn good at what they're doing. So at the moment, if I was to say outside of Ukraine, is there a company which is going to become like the comms leader for drones? I'm going with the Baltics. Great. Let the Baltics go with that. Once again, obviously, I'm going to toot my own horn. Let me be the airframe guy. when it comes to the headsets, maybe give that to the Croatians. But all of this requires Ukrainians to scale. Because, it doesn't. There's an alternative to Ukrainians, and it's China, which personally I think is a pretty terrible option. So if we want to scale and deliver a sufficient mass to deliver a strategic effect without giving the ability to have a strategic effect to our enemy, China, by investing in their capacity to produce that stuff at scale, let's bring the Ukrainians in at scale.
This is a really good point. I've got a point for Cormac and I've got a point for Philip, because what we heard from Macron during the week was a real sort of blast back to something that's not going to work. And that was the idea that all this lovely new money, but because of the Brexit and its wonderful benefits, Britain will be precluded from the contract. You mentioned China, but the question I got for Philip after that is, well, don't we also have to unfortunately preclude the US from this supply chain now? Because again, it's a point of systemic risk. Cormac, let's go first on the Brexit benefits and how it's really not going to fly if Britain is not part of this integrated, agile defence tech sector.
I wanted to say something else. I tweeted about this during the week. I said another effing, and I didn't say effing, actually. I spelt out the broad word. I said another effing Brexit benefit. My understanding is that this is something that can be sorted out, and it needs to be sorted out by a meeting sometime in May. I think that Britain is so central to the defense effort in Europe and has been so central to supporting Ukraine from the very start that absolutely it must be sorted out. But I can't say any more than that. But I wanted to make another point. I wanted to make another point on what Alex was saying about the drones. When I went out in 2016, and this has been a real bugbear of mine ever since I went out to Ukraine. I went out as a first and a one-time diplomat. And I very, very quickly got the impression that not all, I worked with some great people from British diplomats and American diplomats and Canadian diplomats, but I saw an awful lot of people who thought, well, we know better than these slightly backward, underdeveloped Ukrainians, and we're here to tell them how to do it. And if they do what we tell them, then their communications or their whatever is going to improve. I won't give the name, but I sat down the last time I was in Kyiv with a very, very senior former cabinet minister, alone in a hotel having a few pints. We worked very closely together, and he said to me, Cormac, we get a lot of advisors in Ukraine. They come, they achieve nothing, they go, and we forget them. We need collectively an awful lot more humility, and we need to give an awful lot more respect to the Ukrainians. And I'm listening to this conversation, and from what I know, I'm suspecting that this maybe applies at almost every level. We have
Can
not
I give you an
given
example of how ridiculous this is?
Please
So
do, Alex.
our ground control station for our drone systems is made by a Ukrainian company called Drone Space. They also have an NGO called Drone Arnia, where they train drone engineers and drone pilots for free. They essentially make our ground control station. But the ridiculous thing is they make our ground control station, test it works in Ukraine, and they then disassemble it. They then ship it to me in the UK, where we, as a subcontractor to Drone Space UK, reassemble it, test it, and then we then ship it back to Ukraine. Because our customers want to go, oh, this is from a British aerospace company, so it must be fine. This is a combat-tested system, which has been proven. But no, I need to have them test it in Ukraine, do what it has done for years, disassemble the whole damn thing, ship it to me in parts, reassemble it, because it's then ISO 9001, AS 9100 aerospace quality, prove it still works, and then ship it back. Great use of taxpayers' money, right?
Absolutely crazy.
It's just baffling, frankly. I agree with Cormac. I think we need to listen to the Ukrainians far more and recognize that not only are they innovative and resilient and able to capitalize on new technologies because they're in a hot war, but also these are incredibly talented people with, and the standard of education here is extraordinary. So there's one other thing before I answer the question that you posed to me, Jonathan, talking about these drones, is when I first arrived here during the full-scale invasion, I remember going around to little a library or a cultural center or something like that. And you would see all ages, all strata sitting together, knitting camouflage netting, putting together camouflage netting. 3 years on, they're not making camouflage netting. They're supervising and assembling FPV drones from 3D printers that are going 24/7. So they are able to adapt quite quickly to a new environment. And that's another reason why we should be listening to Ukrainians. But I thought it was worth mentioning the juxtaposition about how things have changed from netting to creating drones, little grannies assembling drones. As far as the question of can we
I've met the grannies,
trust,
by the way. I've got a video coming out with the grannies you're talking about. I filmed them all
can't wait to see
at
it.
work. Yeah.
I can't wait to see it because it's well, anyhow, I will wax philosophical about that for hours. As far as the question you posed to me about the Americans and can they be relied upon? Sadly, no. I don't want to chuck the baby out with the bathwater. There are still many things that the Americans can send that will be of great use here, but the damage that the Trump administration is doing, not only in supplying weapons to Ukraine, but damage to our arms manufacturing industry. I mean, we are hearing cries from around Europe that we don't want to buy American because we don't know if we can trust that you're going to supply us with the ancillary things that go along with maintaining an F-16 or whatever it is, or the ATACMS missile system. And as such, who's going to want to buy American? Now, I point this out because this is something that might compel the administration to reverse course on some of this stuff. Because, of course, we all know that Donald J. Trump is very transactional and he's very concerned about economics and making money, wealth, production of wealth. And if Lockheed Martin and Raytheon start coming to the White House and saying all these countries are canceling their orders, they can't trust us, that might have an effect on his judgment and decision making. But right now, I would not be relying on the United States if I were a European NATO partner, and it breaks my heart to say that. I hope it doesn't get worse. I hope there isn't a permanent rupture. It's exactly what Vladimir Putin would like. And again, I think there's serious cause for concern that Trump is compromised. At what level, I don't know. Again, he might just be a fellow traveler or see the world in kind of the same way as Vladimir Putin. I'm not necessarily suggesting he's, an agent of the Kremlin. But it's very disheartening that right now, as somebody who lives on both sides of the Atlantic, that this relationship is being so damaged, and that what used to be a really strong alliance is in really serious trouble. So, I hope they keep sending I hope they keep sending Bradleys. I hope they keep sending M113s. But something sophisticated like an F-16 or an ATACMS or even a HIMARS, I don't know as I would rely on that.
I can give evidence that I don't mean my drones, they're There are kamikazes using their ISR and more sophisticated ones. They're nothing like a Bradley, but I can give evidence to that. The promotional video for one of my drones called a Ghost Squadron Leader specifically has these black and silver colored motors on it. They're from an American company called KDE. I think they're 8 times the price of the Chinese equivalent, and I lose about 10% in efficiency for them. The reason they are on the promo video is because they are American, because that was a risk mitigation strategy which I had presented to a customer or customers, and they liked it. I don't think they're going to like it anymore. So those drones are now flying with Chinese motors. That is how bad it is.
That's disturbing.
It seems we're not going to solve any of these problems here, but of course I think it really helps to highlight this, and hopefully some decision makers are listening into some of these interviews and conversations, and some people are sort of working on these. While you were talking, I mean, the last point there, 2 things that I just saw on Twitter. The juxtaposition of it is unfortunately emblematic of where we are now, and frightening about where we could end up. You have Donald Trump in the Oval Office being asked by a reporter how the ceasefire is going, and he says it's working really, really well. The other image in the following tweet is something that's a cross between the London Blitz and Star Wars, which is Odessa and the vast amount of air defense systems going up to repel huge attack and attempt to obliterate that city, a city which so many Russians are sort of proud of. You know, they have assimilated Odessa into their culture, and many Russians think that actually is a core part of Russian history and heritage, whatever the reality is. And here Russia is trying its best to obliterate it. But it's that juxtaposition between those 2 images feels particularly Orwellian, and also perhaps, you know, not a sense of despair, but it certainly points the way to some difficult weeks. Maybe let's make that just the sort of closing statement of how we need to sort of, you know, try and embrace that dissonance, how we need to acknowledge that it's there and obviously fight it, rather than sticking our heads in the sand and pretending that's not happening. I'll give you all a sort of a quick closing word before we wrap up. Who wants to jump in first?
I'll go first. I think we also have to it's not going to be decisive, but I think it's going to be important. I think we need to find solidarity amongst our citizenry. Obviously, the European leadership, needs to find ways to find commonality. But with this rift, this transatlantic rift, it might be that the citizens have to make our leaders get their act together. I was going to use far more colorful language, but I am also participating in the Easter vehicle fundraising events, so I'll be doing my best. Again, old dogs and new tricks. Fundraising is not my expertise, but I'll be doing my best. And in a shameless plug, I am shameless when it comes to supporting Ukraine. We try to get good, interesting guests on our show every week, every Sunday, from our Kiev-based studio. We go for about an hour long and try to get as in-depth as we possibly can. We want to get those numbers up so that the good old algorithm can promote it. So please do tune in to On the Edge. This week, our guest will be Zarina Zabriskie, who is a wonderful journalist based in living in Odessa, but currently working out of Kherson. And she talks about the human safari, among other topics. This awful way in which the Russians use their drones to hunt down civilians on the streets and chase them, again, as if it's some sort of perverse human safari. And it's a good conversation, one worth tuning into, if I do say so myself. And Jonathan, I appreciate you inviting me on, and I'm at your disposal anytime, because, as I say, I'm utterly shameless when it comes to trying to support Ukraine in these efforts.
It's fantastic and very much appreciated. Alex, how's this sort of Orwellian dissonance sitting with you? I mean, you're somebody who doesn't sit around despairing. You go and you build shit.
I just do drones. But I would actually like to refer back actually to something Cormac said earlier about the Russia's use of essentially taking like literally pre-World War II Goebbels levels tactic and just using social media as a force amplifier. But two can play that game. So I'd say when it comes to fighting back, anyone from home with an internet connection can fight back. You can use the internet to be your force amplifier, your voice amplifier. You don't have to be a cartoon dog on the internet like me, but if you can find a community and find a way to create a voice together, maybe that's your way to fight. It doesn't have to be kinetic. Like, this is an information war just as much as it is a kinetic war. Like, I was out flying, with pretty secretive units, and they were happy to have, well, not happy, they were happy to take photos. They wouldn't let me take photos and videos, but to give them to me to then post on social media, because they understand the importance of Ukraine being in social media, Ukraine being in people's minds. So yeah, my takeaway is like, this is what we're trying to do, I think, in this space is, keep the attention on, keep people's minds on it. You don't have to just observe, you can participate. And it's really not that hard. Find your community, find some friends, go do it. You can make a difference.
And this is you here. Another Alex Ferguson fella online. Take a look. Cormac.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm really just going to agree with what Philip and Alex have said. I said earlier on, I talked about I love quoting von Clausewitz. We need our governments, our armed forces, but we need our civilians. We need our populations on a war footing. I've said before, there has never been a war in history where the information field or the disinformation field is so critical. And to go back to what Alex has just said, that means that's why we all do what we're doing in this space now. We're fighting in the information war. But that also means that every single person who cares and who can be engaged can actually punch in this space. And there's 500 million citizens across Europe, because this is all on Europe and Canada, please God. We're talking about Canada might even join the European Union. But this is really all on Europe and whatever few friends we can pull in from, I don't know, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand. But this is on Europe now. America's lost for the foreseeable future. I mean, we can talk about, is Donald Trump a Russian asset? Well, if he was, he is doing exactly what we would expect him to be doing and what he's doing at the moment. Any Russian asset would be absolutely proud of. And we know the Kremlin is delighted with what he is doing. But enough on that. Yeah, my closing point is we need to engage 500 million citizens across Europe, because we have an economic power that's, I think, 12 times the size of Russia. We have a population that's over 3.5 times their size. We can handle this. But as the great John Sweeney said during the week, America's lost. It's down to the best of us in Europe now to look after Ukraine and to look after ourselves. That's my closing thoughts.
That's a good place to close on. And I encourage people not to despair, but to do stuff. I mean, one of the most inspirational conversations I had was with somebody who's in Moscow, and he just attended the Navalny funeral. Now, we're not going to get into Navalny and the rights and wrongs of that, but of course, anyone attending that funeral was being monitored, photographed, traced back to their residence. So you're taking a risk by doing that. But rather than talking about that and the sort of personal danger, and this is quite a quirky character, it has to be said, he just said, you know what? I'm sick to death of liberal Russians whinging and whining, whining and crying. And even today, it's like, just get off your effing arses and effing do something. And I know this guy does an awful lot of stuff. And I think that was, okay, if someone in that position, in I would say, mortal peril, is in action, then what excuse do we all have not to be in action as well?
None.
Well said.
Yeah, well said, gentlemen.
That's it. We're going to wind this up. Thank you to everyone who has joined us for the live stream. Thank you to everyone who's helping to support us to buy trucks to help Ukraine remain resilient and to help save Ukrainians, as many as we can, as well as push back their illegal invaders on their land. Thank you to everyone who does that and who supports the various initiatives that have been mentioned and follows all the speakers. We're going to end it here, but this may well become a regular Friday tradition. Cafe whatever, we haven't found a name for it yet, whether it's Cafe Freedom, Cafe Main Bastards, Cafe Silicon. We'll come up with a name before the next one. But I think if we establish this tradition, we should hopefully build quite a following and get some useful stuff done into the bargain as well. For today, thank you all to my guests as well. Alex, Philip, Cormac, enjoy the rest of your weekends.
Cheers.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Slava Crown.
Heram
Slava.
Slava.
Smert Varagam. I was at that one.
Order is dead.
To enemies.
Death. Yes. That's what I had on my drone, by the way.
Oh, is it? Yes, that's a good thing to put on a drone.
Give me some more messages. There are more drones coming.